Clark was named the NSC's National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism by President Bill Clinton in 1998. Everything important in the country ran on software, most of it procured on the open market, and yet Clark kept reading about hackers having their way with it. Surely rival governments could be doing that in America as well. Clark's suspicions intensified after the war game exercise Eligible Receiver was run by the Defense Department in 1997. An NSA Red Team, tasked with breaking into Pentagon networks, ran roughshod over them using only conventional tools. Clark didn't know it at the time, but Moscow was already doing the same thing for real in an operation later discovered and dubbed Moonlight Maze. The success of Eligible Receiver prompted the Defense Department to set up the Joint Task Force Computer Network Defense, which would work on behalf of all branches of the military. Yet the leaders of the NSA were still telling Clark there wasn't much to worry about. He met with the CEOs of Microsoft, networking king Cisco, and database giant Oracle, and they said the same thing. They were all telling me their shit didn't stink, and I had a hard time reconciling the fact that Oracle and Microsoft and Cisco were all perfect with the fact that all these hacks were occurring. Clark said, "It seemed obvious I needed to talk to the people doing the hacking, but they were probably criminals. So I asked, are there people like that who are not criminals?" Clark talked to an FBI official who had transferred from the Boston office. He called back a few days later, said the Boston office knows this group of hackers that they vetted, they think they're clean, and when they have technical questions, they ask them stuff. Clark took a crew from the NSC up in early 1998. The Loft Gang suggested a drink at a bar called John Harvard's, then watched silently to see how many officials were there and how long they would sit before getting up to leave. After an hour, when they finally stood, Mudge said hello. After beers, the group invited the NSC team back to the loft. The men showed off a little of what they were working on. As they were leaving, Clark huddled with the other officials in the parking lot. A bit spooked, the hackers told Mudge to tell them it was impolite to whisper in their presence. He marched over and did so, demanding to know what the group was discussing. Everyone looked at Clark, who looked at Mudge frankly. "We were saying we thought all this wouldn't be possible without some government support," he told the long hair. "Have you gotten any?" "No," Mudge replied, then joked, "If you have an offer, we'll listen." Clark paused, then laughed. Clark stayed in touch with Mudge afterward. Out of the group, Mudge was especially receptive. Some old-timers in CDC still instinctively disliked the government, or at least some of its laws, such as the ham-handed Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or certain branches, namely the FBI. But Mudge was among those whose families had been paid by government dollars, and he had worked as a government contractor at BBN. He also felt that everyone should know what he knew. Perhaps the government would still make the wrong calls, he realized, but at least it wouldn't be out of ignorance. There was one last, less noble reason for playing ball. He was counting on people in the military being able to vouch for him if the FBI got overexcited and suddenly raided the loft. Should I find myself in court with a bunch of loft folks, brought up on charges of disturbing the peace or something, I wanted to be able to reach out and have a bunch of people with uniforms and a bunch of medals sitting up there as character witnesses, Mudge said. Clark was quietly preparing an order that would be known as Presidential Decision Directive 63 on critical infrastructure protection, which gave the government more authority to lead on private sector security measures. For ammunition in the intergovernmental turf battles and to head off complaining from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Clark called on his new ally in Boston, and shortly after, Senator Fred Thompson formally asked the 7 current members of the Loft to testify before Thompson's committee about threats from hacking. Mudge said they would only do it if they could use their hacker names, which was all that had been public about them up to that point, in order to protect their day jobs. Thompson agreed. The National Security Council had a message they wanted to get out, and this was an opportunity for the loft to interact with the government without us being labeled as criminals, Mudge said. Everyone who didn't already own a suit bought or borrowed one, and they testified in May 1998. Chris Wysopal, Brian Hassick, Joe Grand, and 3 other members of the loft sat with Mudge and his heavy metal hair in the middle. He was the only one present who was in the cult of the dead cow. Dan McMillan had moved west. John Lester had been displaced from the loft, and future CDC member Christian Ryu wouldn't join the loft for a few more months. If you're looking for computer security, then the internet is not the place to be, Mudge told the senators. How can we be expected to protect the system and the network when all of the 7 individuals seated before you can tear down the foundation that the network was built upon? The most dramatic claim they made during the testimony was that they could take down the internet in 30 minutes through a problem they had found in the internet's routing procedure, Border Gateway Protocol. The loft had already contacted the relevant manufacturers about the issue, Mudge said later. The senators present were far more alarmed by what they heard from the hackers than they had been by what the military and intelligence brass were saying. We were a visceral representation of what the adversarial view was, Wysopal said. The testimony made the loft into the first group of rock star hackers, and Mudge was the band leader. But even with cover from the government, he and others in the loft, especially the newer and cleaner members like Wysopal and Christian, were nervous about their plans to not just improve the state of security, but earn a living in the process. They knew the loft couldn't make things up or throw verbal hand grenades at the government or giant companies. For that, there was the bad cop, CDC, which played with seeming sinister. Both groups were mad that Microsoft had sidestepped Back Orifice without getting serious about security. It sent 2 messages: that Back Orifice was not a problem, and that to the extent some users felt it was, they could always just switch to Windows NT or later versions. The only way to fight back was to create a new version of Back Orifice that could beat the new operating system. That would show that Microsoft's main programs remained fundamentally broken because they did not give users a reliable way to know what was trustworthy on their machines. Christian was the best person to write the 1999 sequel to Back Orifice, and he had been drafted to CDC earlier that year. But though he was being paid by the loft at the time, the loft could not publish what they decided to call Back Orifice 2000 because that would have tied the loft too closely to CDC and therefore to DEF CON and costumes and rapping along with the air of drugs and crime. BO2K couldn't have been loft because it already had stank on it, Mudge said. It had to remain separate from the loft to avoid alienating the Richard Clarks of the world, who were potential loft customers and partners. CDC would release BO2K with even more spectacle at DEF CON in July 1999 than it had created the year before. Though Windows NT had been put together much more carefully than Windows 98, the core problem remained. The computer handed off too much control to outside programs that were not signed digitally or otherwise attested to as authentic by Microsoft or the vendors of those programs. As a result, it was only a modest challenge for a hacker to get a malicious program running on a Windows machine, then hide the fact that it was there. CDC wanted to warn everyone that Microsoft's security setup was too complex and that users could be running something dangerous without knowing it. It wanted the company to require customers to verify the source and condition of the outside software so they could then decide what to trust. Our position should not be one of Microsoft bashing, but rather of user education, Christian wrote to the others in the group. Microsoft had screwed up, and it needs to take responsibility for putting so much power in the hands of the user. Christian's program was dramatically better than Josh Bookbinder's. Beyond the coding improvements, CDC wanted to settle an argument by Microsoft supporters and some hackers that Back Orifice was unsafe and might contain a backdoor for CDC, neither of which was true. This time, the group wanted to release the code, to make it open source. That would prove that there was nothing up CDC's sleeve. It would also up the stakes by making it easy for hackers to modify it, rendering antivirus programs, which look for identical versions of the things previously flagged as bad far less effective. The Atlanta FBI office warned the Pentagon and other potential targets that the new version would be potentially more destructive and difficult to eradicate, and that all concerned should aggressively review and monitor their security measures. The Defense Department's Criminal Investigative Service looked into BO2K to help the military develop countermeasures, but did not pursue the matter beyond that. There would be more hacking, and that would put more pressure on Microsoft to make deeper fixes to its programs. As before, CDC drew the line at integrating any additional program that would take advantage of a software flaw to deliver and install the tool. The lack of such an exploit limited the group's moral culpability, CDC felt. The members were distributing a safe-cracking tool, but not the keys to the vault that held the safe. There was also a risk of legal liability. Courts had by then ruled that code was speech, and therefore almost no regulation could stop it from being written and distributed. But most serious programs also used encryption for communication. In the case of BO2K, the encryption would prevent data that was moving from an infected computer to the hacker's computer from being intercepted and deciphered. The Clinton administration had continued to clamp down on the export of strong cryptography over the objection of U.S.-based multinational technology firms. The government likened serious encryption to a weapon, albeit a defensive one, and made it subject to export controls. As is still the case, Washington wanted to maintain its ability to break codes used elsewhere. If strong encryption products go to other countries, that makes it harder. So Uncle Sam has used a variety of regulations to stop or hinder such exports. Christian did not want to get in trouble with the U.S. government. A lawyer was hired to take a look at the program and make sure they wouldn't get in export trouble. She advised them to put a little more effort into keeping the program out of enemy hands, at least until some pending court cases over similar issues were resolved. She told them to check whether the downloaders' Internet Protocol addresses were in the U.S. and to have the locals promise not to transfer the program beyond the border. Those outside the U.S. got a version with less encryption. The first rule of the Hacktivist is to not get caught, Kevin wrote to the list. Federal time is bad time. In a new experiment, CDC decided to call BO2K a tool for remote administration in its press kit and documentation. In effect, it would be making the argument that the software was the most sophisticated tool for surreptitious electronic break-ins, while also being among the best tools ever made for corporate staffers to remotely monitor what was running on office computers and install new programs. While Symantec and Compaq charged more than $100 for remote tools, CDC would offer similar or better capabilities for free, with code the user could examine. If the group pulled it off, it would be dropping the pants of not just Microsoft, but also the established security companies, which CDC felt were getting fat on the internet stock market boom while peddling average products. The security establishment showed its true colors as launch date neared. Atlanta-based Internet Security Systems, which it first sold stock to the public in 1998, railed against the dangers of the impending BO2K to drum up its own business. But behind the scenes, it was sweet-talking CDC and asking for an advance copy of the program. That way, it could claim to be blocking BO2K before it came out. An ISS intermediary even offered cash, which was a terrible way to approach a group of volunteers who were convinced they had found the moral high ground. ISS is just flat-out sleazy in a lot of ways, Mudge said then. CDC exposed the offer and sent a reply it leaked to the press, saying, We are gladly willing to provide you with the software you desire if and only if you will, on exchange, grant us $1 million and a monster truck. Some ISS employees worked in the office through the DEF CON weekend, and they sent kids to the show floor to grab a CD and upload it at the first possible moment. Because CDC wanted maximum impact, it needed maximum press. For that to happen, it had to have a touch of evil, Kevin reasoned, the same way a punk or metal band craved condemnation. The hip press has to love us and the square press has to hate us for this to work. That's the eternal conflict in society to play off and ride. He wrote to the group, "The day evangelist Pat Robertson says something positive about CDC is the day we're over. The conflict, the drama, is what makes this interesting and worth writing about." The insider appeal helped as well. When the group made jokes only other hackers got, it gave it street credibility and simultaneously impressed the outsiders, who realized CDC resonated with real hackers more than the people in suits did. But Kevin warned the group not to get cocky, reminding them that CDC had started by mocking the Legion of Doom and other self-serious coders. The point was to have fun and be useful. He wrote just before DEF CON, "If we fall for our own hype, that's the same pathetic retard bullshit that useless rock stars and movie stars fall for. When they can't handle the pressure and get some debilitating drug habit or become assholes, 'cause they don't understand their role in a system." When the big day came, the presentation began with electronic music and the recorded voices of a farmer ordering his daughter to put a cow back in the barn and the girl refusing. With lights pulsating on the screen in the darkened room, Kevin rapped rhythmically and paced the stage for more than 5 minutes. It was the first full rock and roll hacker release, complete with stencil spotlights beaming the group's longhorn symbol. "CDC loves you," Kevin shouted, and once again led a call and response chant, "Dead, cow, kicks, ass." Even after the house lights came up, he went on, performing a mock faith healing and calling for amens from the thousands in the audience. Finally exhausted, he asked Sam Tweedyfish Anthony to introduce the rest of the 19 CDC members assembled on stage, by far the most in any one place. "This is Death Veggie, you all know him," Sam began. "The future of programming, Mr. Dilldog." He went through them all, ending with the surprise reappearance of co-founder Bill Brown, wearing an old-fashioned suit. Then Sam said he needed to make 2 amendments to his year-old exhortation to go out and hack. Pick a cause instead of hacking at random, and don't get caught. Christian then gave a straightforward demo of the core product and some of the available additions, stressing that the code was thoroughly customizable. The crowd repeatedly interrupted him with applause and oohs and ahs after he explained features, like the ability to delve into other machines connected to the target. After he and Josh fielded questions, the light suddenly went out again. Bill pulled off his tearaway suit from the front, revealing pasties on his chest. Mudge played rapid licks on the guitar and smashed it against an old PC. Christian had burned advanced copies of BO2K onto CDs with a machine owned by Ninja Strike Force member Lemore Freed, whom he was dating. Unfortunately, her machine had been infected with a virus known as Chernobyl, which spread to the CDs for the press and those the group brought to Las Vegas to toss to the crowd, which included diving ISS employees. Once hackers at DEF CON uploaded it to the net, someone detected the virus and cried foul. CDC once again faced suspicions of hacking fellow hackers. CDC admitted the screw-up and apologized. Fortunately, the version available for download from the CDC website was clean all along. Christian was so young and had come to CDC so quickly that he didn't have connections to criminals like some of the others. When people asked him whether malicious hackers would use his creation for crime, Christian said he didn't think so. In retrospect, that was implausibly naive. Though far from malicious himself, he said he wasn't at the pious extreme either, but a question asker. I am not completely white hat, because I wasn't trying to secure the world, but to raise awareness. Kevin's hometown paper saw nothing but black hats, and Swamp Rat couldn't have been happier. We prefer to call it what it is: organized crime and terrorism, the Lubbock Avalanche Journal declared in an editorial condemning BO2K. BO2K is a weapon. It has no useful purpose other than to attack and destroy the property of an individual or corporation. We believe that it is time for an aggressive campaign against organized hacking. We find it disgraceful that a weapon like BO2K can be given in an in-your-face public release by CDC without any real fear by the group or its members of being held accountable. As Kevin recapped it for friends, the paper was practically calling us godless commies and a threat to the American way of life and their daughter's virginity. It was fucking beautiful. Security companies didn't go as far as all that, but they generally categorized BO2K as a virus. Finland-based F-Secure noted that it was likely to be used by hackers, especially since the program went to such lengths to run without detection and to avoid being deleted. It kept changing its process identifier and created new processes in case one was killed. The best-known cryptography expert of the era, Bruce Schneier, gave it a qualified thumbs up. He wrote that it was useful for systems administrators. He also acknowledged that miscreants would love it, since BO2K was one of the coolest hacking tools ever developed. Schneier openly addressed the philosophical game that CDC was playing, and he declared it a winner. Since it is not distributed by a respectable company, it cannot be trusted. Since it was written by hackers, it is evil. Since its malicious uses are talked about more, its benevolent uses are ignored. That's wrong, Schneier wrote on his blog. He said that Microsoft security was virtually non-existent in Windows 95 and 98, and that a user would have to make more than 300 adjustments from the defaults in Windows NT to make it safe. Microsoft had created the danger, and what Back Orifice has done is made mainstream computer users aware of the danger. Maybe the world would have been safer had they not demonstrated the danger so graphically. But I am not sure, Schneier wrote. Microsoft only responds to security threats if they are demonstrated. Explain the threat in an academic paper, and Microsoft denies it. Release a hacking tool like Back Orifice, and suddenly they take the vulnerability seriously. Some of the most enthusiastic support came from those high up in government and defense contractors. One Lockheed Martin expert wrote to a security mailing list that the fanfare around Back Orifice had prompted him to look into the prevalence of Trojan programs, which allow computer takeovers, and that he had been stunned to find more than 10 in quiet circulation. He said the new noise around BO2K was the shock treatment that network administrators needed. If your security is not strong enough to stop script kiddies with publicly available tools, then you have no hope of securing your network from professionals waging war, he wrote. Wake up, people. It's going to get much, much worse. In public, Microsoft again poo-pooed the issues, even after hackers posted videos of themselves taking over strangers' machines. In private, it panicked once more. An executive asked security worker Rob Whitey Beck, a friend of Carrie Campbell, to have her bring in a video of the DEF CON presentation. Carrie wanted to help Microsoft do better, so she walked across the street to campus, met the executive, and then gasped as he took the CD she handed him and popped it into his office computer. "Wait," she said, before he could type run. "Do you have a sandboxed machine?" She meant one where a malicious program couldn't move to other computers. The man stared at her. "You're not putting that CD into a machine connected to the network, are you?" "Sure," he said. Really? Don't you have a separate box you can put that into?" Another blank look. So let me get this right. You have a member of an internationally famous hacker group that just released a tool to help people defeat Microsoft security, sitting in front of you. You don't know her at all, and you're putting a homemade CD she handed you directly into your machine? Please tell me you at least are running an antivirus tool against it. He wasn't. All the noise still hadn't fully penetrated Microsoft, but it had finally gotten through to Microsoft customers, especially banks, who pressed the company to make serious changes or risk losing them all to Linux. After BO2K, Microsoft did more to promote the use of digital signatures that established who was standing behind a program. File integrity became a big thing too, Beck said, with software that checked that a program had not been altered. Security budgets rose across the industry as companies spent more on deeper security research and bought firewalls and intrusion detection systems. Pulling off feats like the Orifice launches 2 years in a row cemented CDC's position in security culture as the internet boom was peaking. In a format later adopted by Reddit for its AMAs, the leading tech discussion site Slashdot arranged that fall for CDC to answer reader questions under their various handles. Amid a lot of joking and posed crudeness, they articulated quite a few beliefs and goals for security that had many tech industry readers nodding. They especially wanted software companies to put more thought, effort, and money into user safety and privacy, even if they did not consider themselves to be in the security business. Make security concerns and security audits an integral part of the development process, rather than an afterthought, urged Sam. Added Christian, encrypt everything. Eliminate HTTP and go right to HTTPS everywhere. About 19 years later, Google's Chrome browser would finally begin warning users who reached HTTP sites that they were not secure. Since they all had day jobs, they laughed off suggestions that they distribute a greatly expanded suite of software. But they actually had more ambition than they let on. They had already begun following a path proposed by the member, urging them to use their notoriety for the greatest possible good. Oxblood Ruffin. Chapter 7. Oxblood. Laird Brown was the truest outsider to be welcomed into the cult of the dead cow, and yet he would have the greatest impact on its trajectory. He was a Canadian-born internationalist in a group dominated by Americans, and a modest technologist who joined at a time when CDC was attracting some of the best minds in security. Laird brought two things: a more refined style of Kevin Wheeler quality marketing and a sense of moral urgency. Kevin and Bill Brown had always held that CDC was not about technology itself. It was about connection and communication. As it probed technological issues more deeply, the group became more frustrated with the way companies and government officials were acting. The big companies ignored problems unless they were exposed so badly that customers threatened to leave, which was rare for a monopoly like Microsoft. The security industry was not fixing things because the fundamental problems ran deeper than software. It was about business models, corporate power, and legal limitations. And the government was oblivious, slow-moving, or bought off, especially outside of the military. CDC had absorbed all of that, and with its newly bestowed rockstar status, it was ready to take the argument to a more radical place. Tall and garrulous but cerebral, Laird had shown up before the back orifice releases. He had read John Lester's personal account of hijinks at HoHoCon 94, and he emulated its style. He spoke CDC's own language and gradually convinced its members to stake out a broader position. Because he understood where the group had been and where it was heading, he had the answer to their nagging sense of frustration. He began with a light-hearted, oddball, flattering email out of the blue to Luke Benfey at his loft address in September 1995. Cher Legume, it addressed Veggie. I know your travails, the many calls upon your fertile resources. Alas, It is part of the burden of greatness. That is why it pains me all the more to elicit your teaching. Using Latin as well as French and his own version of self-mocking leet-speak, Laird said that he had spent 2 days reading CDC's archived text files and was terribly sorry to bother him, but wanted to know if there was anything else nearly as hip that Luke could recommend. The emails came sporadically over the next year, usually to one or a few members of CDC, who forwarded them to the whole list. Laird said he was working for a not-for-profit technical consulting group with a lot of Canadian government contracts. Laird came by a sense of ethics, disdain for authority, and showmanship well before college. Born in 1950 to a welder father and teacher mother in the Toronto suburb of Hamilton, Laird was a nominal Protestant, but he attended a boys' Catholic high school and enjoyed the clear moral framework of those around him, including strong support for the civil rights movement in the U.S. and for Vietnam protesters, many of whom fled to Canada to avoid the draft. It was a defining moment. All these things appeared to me to be moral evils, especially denial of civil rights, Laird said. He played classical violin from early childhood and performed on a range of instruments in various genres for money while studying music at the University of Windsor, until the studying took all the fun out of it. After jobs as an auto factory worker, cook, and photographer, Laird moved to New York. There he edited insider newsletters at the United Nations, and then, assisting a State Department retiree who had intelligence connections, compiled a multi-volume compendium about the inner workings of the UN. I read 1 million documents and found out who everyone was, Laird said, developing deep knowledge of the ideals and practicalities there. Then he consulted for West African and South American countries, explaining how things worked at the UN. He stayed until the Libyan mission offered him a lucrative job as spokesman. It would have been ridiculous to accept, but the offer prompted self-examination that ended with Laird leaving the city and moving back to Toronto. During his decade at the UN, the predicament of Chinese dissidents haunted Laird. Market liberalization in the 1980s had helped spawn a student movement in China for greater freedom of speech and democracy, and the Communist Party wavered on how to respond. After as many as 1 million protesters gathered in Tiananmen Square in 1989, Premier Li Peng declared martial law and sent in troops, who killed more than 100. Liberals were purged from Communist Party leadership, and the range of permitted discussion topics narrowed sharply. Still, Laird's activism began only when he joined CDC in 1996. Befitting someone who had labored for years among the silver tongues at the UN, Laird's tone remained respectful, even as he became a part of the group. But he gradually began cajoling CDC for change, with one underlying point and a well-chosen target. The point was that CDC was famous but did not stand for much that was vital beyond tech security, and the area to expand the vision, he suggested, involved the Chinese government. It was a deeply personal argument because Laird had traveled in Asia and was close to people fighting for human rights in China. He also said that during his time at the UN, he had met Chinese diplomats who had hinted at unhappiness with events in their homeland. From the early days, Laird told the others about a guy he had met back in Toronto, a Chinese exile helping others get out in the wake of the massacre in and around Tiananmen Square. Gradually, the story got more elaborate. The friend was protected by mobsters who smuggled people for other reasons. He had a network of helpers, and he was interested in using technology to help dissidents, which was conveniently right up the alley of CDC. The House rules of CDC said that everyone would get a chance to weigh in on a candidate for membership, but that Kevin would have the final say. In addition, someone needed to meet him in person. Luke visited Laird in Toronto in the summer of 1996, and Laird was admitted to CDC not long afterward. For his handle, he picked Oxblood Ruffin, combining a reference to the oxblood-colored Doc Martens boots, popular in the British punk scene, with a nod to David Ruffin, lead singer for The Temptations on songs including My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg. In October, Luke returned to Toronto with John Lester and Sam Anthony in tow. Laird memorialized the event in classic CDC style, with a funny text file-style email to the rest of CDC announcing that they had conducted the first annual Wonton Con at a Chinatown restaurant. He described the restaurant as a favored hangout of the Hong Kong Blondes, a pairing of Chinese computer scientists and Democratic activists, who he said could not join them that day for security reasons. A few months later, Laird gave an odd internal backstory for the Hong Kong Blondes. He emailed the others that he had invented the group as a joke, but his unnamed boss at the not-for-profit web consultancy had been fascinated by the fiction, this great mythical force on the net that could spawn imitators and confuse the Chinese government. Laird told CDC that he'd introduced his supervisor to the exiled dissidents in Toronto and that the Blondes had become a reality. The Chinese government provided the perfect catalyst to push CDC into politics. It hated the free flow of information, a core value of CDC and the hacker movement it helped lead. China also naturally opposed the U.S. government, where some of CDC and many of their friends and relatives worked. And China was doing business with the same companies CDC loved to hate, chief among them, Microsoft. Laird was a master marketer, and his cause sharpened his drive. Though his mysterious arrival and vague background perplexed the group, Laird spoke human, Misha Kubeka said, and that was a big step forward for the geeks. No matter what, he would find a way to tell a compelling story that would hook the media, security practitioners, and perhaps mainstream technologists. Thank goodness we had Laird's guidance, Carrie Campbell said. He said, "You have a little window of fame right now. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to run around like idiots or get something done?" Laird was becoming the new wise elder, the role Chris Tucker had played. Like Chris Tucker, Laird wasn't coming from nowhere. He was building on the politicization that had been expressed most dramatically earlier in 1996 by the Electronic Frontier Foundation's John Perry Barlow, a libertarian Republican. While a party had raged on around him during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Barlow had read that an over-the-top attempt to ban web porn had just been signed into law in America as part of telecom legislation. A declaration of the independence of cyberspace was Barlow's over-the-top response. A deliberate echo of Thomas Jefferson, it began with a hint of Karl Marx. "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." The 16-paragraph war whoop would soon be posted on tens of thousands of websites. "We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity," they said. In China, Germany, France, Russia, Singapore, Italy, and the United States, you are trying to ward off the virus of liberty by erecting guard posts at the frontiers of cyberspace. These may keep out the contagion for a small time, but they will not work in a world that will soon be blanketed in bit-bearing media. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before. It was idealistic, more than a bit silly, and remarkably naive for a technology culture that was already rewarding exploitation of click-happy human behavior. 20 years later, Barlow said that the innocence was a deliberate pose. "I knew the arrival of the net was liable to be as powerful in a very negative way as it was powerful in a very positive way. If it was possible for everything to be known for everyone curious about it, it was also going to be possible for just about anyone everywhere to devise turnkey totalitarianism where they could flip a switch and see everything you are up to. Barlow wanted to set cultural expectations, he said, to strengthen the side of righteousness for the battles to come. I wanted people to think and feel that what we were entering into was a golden era, and that it was about freedom, and that it was about the explosion and dissemination of knowledge. And with any luck, we would figure out how to deal with the horrible part as those situations arose. For all its calculated omissions and excesses of passion, Barlow's howl resonated with a burgeoning crowd of technologists, aspirants, and consumers who badly wanted the government to do anything other than screw up the greatest invention of their lifetimes. The biggest fans as a class were the programmers, the people creating technology daily for themselves and for others. By definition, they were all always at work on something unreleased that was going to be better than what had gone before. Within that group, the greatest enthusiasts were the hackers, the nonconformists and explorers who took things apart and put them back together in different ways, and who were the most likely in the world to, in the process, break laws, like the Telecommunications Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Given their tendencies to work in isolation and reject social norms, it is hard to generalize about hacker beliefs. A great many tinkerers did their best to ignore large chunks of the outside world, especially the parts devoted to politics, and some did not pay much attention even to hackers working in adjacent spaces, like other hardware or operating systems or applications. But it is fair to say that most of those who were paying attention to the political world, a number that would grow dramatically as Barlow's half-imaginary independent cyberspace clashed more with the reality of government, were on his side. As Barlow's declaration reverberated inside CDC alongside Laird's railing about China, Misha would invent the term hacktivism, a portmanteau of hacking and activism, and a concept that would play an enormous role for decades as hackers explored their role in society. The word describes what the Hong Kong Blondes and CDC are doing together. Hacktivism, Misha wrote to the group. The following year featured an August revival of a hacking conference put on in New York 3 years earlier by 2600 magazine, called Hackers on Planet Earth, or HOPE. The name, updated for the 1997 edition as Beyond Hope, was emblematic of a conference that would focus more on idealism than DEF CON did. It attracted 2,000 people, double the 1994 crowd. CDC members had multiple speaking slots, including a Saturday afternoon loft panel featuring Mudge and a Sunday afternoon panel with 8 from CDC. It was the first hacking conference of any kind that Laird had attended, and by this point, he had managed to latch on to CDC and take a surprisingly solid lead role within the group. Luke played MC for the half-hour panel, introducing by their handles Chris Tucker, Uber Hacker Laureate, Mudge, Sam Anthony, Foreign Minister Laird, Kerry, and John Lester. Though the panel was conducted as a general update on the group's activities, Luke made clear that the most important development was a strategic alliance it was announcing with a Chinese pro-democracy group called the Hong Kong Blondes, which included technologists and activists. He then turned things over to Laird for his public debut as Oxblood. Clean-cut and short-haired, Laird was the only one on the panel who seemed like he would have been at ease in a suit, though he instead wore a yellow sports shirt. Laird said that when he was working at the UN, he had met Chinese dissidents who were abroad as far back as 1989 and had stayed in touch with them even after that year's slaughter at Tiananmen Square drove the democracy movement out of view. He explained that the Blonde's name referred to slang for gold, which was seen as a cornerstone of freedom, and described some of what life was like under the repressive regime. He seemed to take credit for giving the Blondes the idea of using the net to help coordinate protests. A couple of years ago, I was asking one of my contacts from Princeton, "Do you guys use the net for any of your advocacy?" It sort of struck a bell with him, and he said, "Maybe that's not a bad idea." The next thing we know, he was getting in touch with some of his colleagues and his associates who were computer scientists and also very sympathetic to the democratic struggle. Laird said, "The Hong Kong Blondes had formally started in September 1996 with CDC offering advice. The hacking community is an international community," he said in a 6-minute talk. "We're all in the same community." Chris Nightstalker Tucker urged hackers in the U.S. to be more active politically and educate lawmakers. And Sam said that those well-versed in tech could have a major role in at least calling attention to the plight of the Chinese and others. "We have greater power than anyone else, those of us who understand this technology, to disseminate the information. And when the information is out there, it helps." The group then fielded questions about the Blondes, security, text files, and an open-source operating system project led by an associate. For conference chief and 2600 founder Eric Corley, CDC had the perfect upbeat activism he wanted. "They had fun and conveyed an important message," Corley said. CDC was unique. The New York appearance gave the people who had traveled a chance to catch up with the local CDC members as well as each other. Laird had met very few of his fellow members before that weekend. They were just electronic pen pals and collaborators. Chris Tucker had never met Sam or Carrie. An especially joyful reunion occurred between Carrie and another old-timer, Psychedelic Warlord. Warlord had gone east for college and toured in a punk band during 2 of his college summers. Carrie had housed him and his bandmates and fed them when they reached Seattle. Now in New York and working at an internet access provider, Warlord was out of hacking and didn't attend the formal events. Instead, he met the group at the conference's home at the Puck Building on Friday night and came out with them for a party. Carrie, sporting short blonde hair and black lipstick, introduced Warlord to John, Sam, friend of the herd Lemore Freed, and others who had joined CDC after his time. They talked about the old days, and Warlord wondered if CDC home Demon Roach Underground was still working. One of the others dialed Kevin's modem number and held up the phone to let Warlord hear it try to connect, proof that it was still humming along. Oxblood had the spotlight for just a few minutes of a group panel on the last day of the conference. Most of those in the audience were interested in hacking, not Chinese politics. The mainstream press had not yet turned sustained attention to security, and CDC had not yet won the fame that would come from back orifice. So there was little media attention. One young reporter, Eric Hesseldahl, was intrigued and kept after Oxblood. A half-year later, he wrote a short piece in Wired magazine about the Blondes, passing along Oxblood's new claim to him that they had disabled a Chinese satellite. Given the wild history of how hackers had so readily cross-pollinated with anti-establishment and counterculture types in the West in the 1970s, it wasn't much of a leap to believe, though I think hope is a more accurate word, that similar things were taking place in China. Hesseldahl said later, "While most of the active CDC members were excited about Josh Bookbinder's work on back orifice, Laird kept talking to Hesseldahl, who pressed him for an introduction to any member of the dissident group. Laird demurred but said he could ask questions on the reporter's behalf. That developed into a full-fledged text file in the form of an interview between Laird, writing as Oxblood, and the dissident, whom he dubbed Blondie Wong. Laird wrote that the conversation had taken place at a Toronto dive rock bar called Ted's Collision and Body Repair. Their talk centered on Blondie's underground network of technology-savvy rebels in China, which had grown by 20 members in the previous year, thanks in large part to advice from hacking groups, including the Cult of the Dead Cow. When I understood how far the Cult of the Dead Cow reached into the hacker world and how things were organized, I was able to take the best and use it for our struggle," Blondie said. They chatted about Seinfeld, Bruce Lee, fashion, and high school alienation. But the familiar bantering sucked in casual readers in order to dump them in dark territory. The murder of Blondie's father by Mao's Red Guards, and the massacre of student protesters at Tiananmen. Blondie said the brutal repression convinced him to stay abroad and work to protect his compatriots at home. He asked readers to educate themselves, to keep trade relations contingent on improvements in human rights, and to expose or even hack American companies doing business with China. If people want to participate, they should use the skills that they have, Blondie told Oxblood. Laird gave an advanced version of the interview transcript to Hesseldahl as exclusive material, knowing that would make the article more appealing. Hesseldahl pitched his follow-up story to Wired again, but it demurred, and he ended up with a deal at online spin-off Wired News. The story traveled from there far more than it would have from most outlets. Despite the internet boom, most reporters were new to tech coverage, and almost none had expertise in security. Wired News was different. Its reporters knew about tech, security, and the cult of the dead cow. So when mainstream reporters read Wired News' coverage of the Hong Kong blondes, they assumed the publication had vetted its sources and knew what it was talking about. CDC members had mixed first reactions to Laird's text file, but most were impressed. They believed the story because the details in his writing matched what he had told them before. But Kevin and CDC text files editor Misha, whose reputations were more on the line, smelled something funny. Looking over a pre-publication draft, Kevin wrote to the list, "The Blondie Wong interview is great. How much of that is real?" Laird replied, "It's 3/4 real and the rest is a bunch of yang." Misha, charged with editing it, was more blunt in writing directly to Laird. "For the most part, Blondie, doesn't get some of your humorous turns of phrase, and he himself speaks in a very formal, careful language. And then out of the blue in parts, he says stuff like, 'The guy's an idiot. I mean, if I want advice from the president about getting a blowjob from a young girl, I'm all ears.' I gotta ask, is this interview for real? Or did you write both parts?" For all his doubts, Misha was backed into a corner. Laird had already given the file to Wired News, which had used it to publish its own story. As leader of the Hong Kong Blondes hacking group, Wong has the credentials to back up his threats. Hesseldahl wrote, "The Hong Kong Blondes claim to have found significant security holes within Chinese government computer networks, particularly systems related to satellite communications. It would look awfully strange if CDC did not print its own scoop. Besides, Misha thought the piece might raise awareness, and he had been solidly behind media pranks in the past. He smoothed out Laird's interview and published it on the CDC site." After the Wired News piece, Naomi Klein got in touch. The rising Canadian journalist saw the Toronto angle and was especially interested in China. Clinton had been working to normalize relations and de-emphasize human rights, and he had just conducted the first presidential visit to the nation since the Tiananmen massacre. She thinks we're this righteous, politicized hacking machine out for world peace or something. Anyway, we're going to get a lot of miles out of this baby, Laird wrote to the group. He was right. Klein's wide-eyed write-up in the Toronto Star reported that the blondes are the hacker wing of China's pro-democracy movement, scattered around the world and forced underground after Tiananmen. On July 7th, days after Bill Clinton returned from his trip to China, Blondie Wong, the pseudonymous director of the Blondes, met with Ruffin, and the two went public with a new level in political hacking. Many other outlets picked up Klein's account. She would go on to write books including No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies, which also quoted Blondie Wong. The story seemed to have come from the future. It flew from site to site on the still young web, a fantastic tale of accomplished, mysterious hackers aiding heroic human rights activists inside a totalitarian world power. Though no one besides Laird even claimed to have been in contact with Blondie, described variously as an astrophysicist and a currency trader, or to have any other corroboration, more stories followed, bolstered by the innocence of the reporters and the fact that CDC previously had established itself in the national media as an elite club of hacking gurus. CDC was now ecstatic, and it used the blondes to stake out moral high ground. As Kevin paced the DEF CON stage to launch Back Orifice and a year later BO2K, he cited the blondes as the prime example of what the group was fighting for. When Microsoft switched from dismissing Back Orifice as a toy to calling it dangerous and attacking CDC for releasing it, Luke sent out a press release tying the company to China and suggesting that hacktivists use Back Orifice to attack businesses in bed with the regime. Was releasing Back Orifice to the public immoral? Microsoft would love for their customers to believe that we're the bad guys and that they, as vendors of a digital sieve, bear no responsibility whatever. But questions of morality are more often relative than absolute. So to make things easier, we'll frame our culture and actions against theirs and let the public determine which one of us looks better in black. We'd like to ask Microsoft, or more to the point, we'd like to ask Bill Gates, why he stood shoulder to shoulder in 1996 with China's president and head of the Communist Party to denounce any discussion of China's human rights record at the annual meeting of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. Was the decision to cozy up to the world's largest totalitarian state based on some superior moral position, or was it just more convenient to trample human decency underfoot and go for even more money? Now let's return to Back Orifice. Would it be immoral to use this tool for untoward purposes on Windows networks? Would it be immoral for Back Orifice to find its way to China and cause a lot of dry heaving in Microsoft's largest target market? Should hacktivists use Back Orifice as a form of protest against multinationals who share Microsoft's position of dollars before dignity? It's a short life, and we're all going to be judged by our actions. So, whether or not we've done the right thing is a matter for history and human conscience to decide. But if the gods want to curse us for bringing fire down from the mountain, we'll take a seat with Prometheus and deal with the heat.